In the spring of 1873, on a brown bend of the Snake River below Ferry Butte in Idaho Territory, a woman named Cora Bly stood on a sinking ferry deck and counted the planks she could no longer trust. There were 11 of them gone soft at the seam. The river that morning ran high and the color of strong tea, and the men gathered on the east bank had come to watch her fail rather than to cross. She had buried her husband 6 weeks before, and the ferry he left her, the only crossing for 14 miles in either direction, listed at its mooring like a thing already given up on. What none of those men knew, and what Cora herself did not yet know, was that the deck beneath her boots held a secret her husband had carried to his grave, and that the very rot they laughed at would be the thing that brought it into the light. This is a story about a woman everyone wrote off, and about the patient work of hands that refused to quit. Stay with it, because what she found under that deck was worth more than the ferry, worth more than the land, worth more than the silence of the men who mocked her. Cora Bly was 28 years old that spring, and she had come to the Snake River country 4 years earlier as a bride. Her husband, Amos, had run the ferry before her, a flat barge of fir planks slung on a cable that spanned the narrows, hauled hand over hand by a windlass an aging horse could turn. It was hard money and steady, a nickel for a man on foot, a quarter for a wagon and team, and for 4 years it had kept them in flour and lamp oil and little else. Then a winter fever took Amos in the space of 9 days, and the men of the settlement at Three Pines began, almost at once, to speak of Cora in the past tense. She had grown up in a river town in Missouri, the daughter of a man who built and repaired flatboats for the trade that moved down to the Mississippi. His name was Thomas Vane, and his yard sat on a mud flat below the town where the willows leaned out over the brown water. And Cora's earliest memory was the smell of pine pitch warming in an iron pot and the steady knock of a maul on a caulking iron. Her father had no sons who lived. 2 had come, and 2 had gone before their first winters, and the river town buried its children quietly in those years, and did not speak of it after. So Thomas Vane did the thing the men of his trade did not do. He taught his daughter what he knew, all of it, as though she had been the son the fevers took. He taught her to read the grain of green oak and seasoned fir, to lay her thumb along a board and feel where it would bend true and where it would betray her. He taught her to drive an iron spike at the angle that would not split the plank, and to clinch the point over on the far side so the spike could never work loose with the heave of the water. He taught her to caulk a seam with oakum teased fine and bedded in hot pitch, struck home with the iron until it would turn water for a decade and not a season. He taught her the patient arithmetic of buoyancy, how much weight a given hull could carry before the river claimed the difference, and he made her work the figures on a slate until she could do them in her head with the boat already loading at the bank. He was a spare man with few words, and the words he had, he saved for the work. He was dead now, too, 11 years in the ground of that same river town, taken by a winter on the lungs the year Cora turned 17. But his hands lived on in hers, and his voice came to her at the work, the way a hymn comes back unbidden, whole, without her sending for it. Measure twice, he had told her 100 times, because the river measures once and keeps no copy. And he had told her another thing, on one of the last good days, with the pitch pot smoking between them. A thing built honest will outlast the man who built it, he said, and a thing built false will pull him down into the water with it. She had been too young to know he was telling her how to live. She knew it now. The men did not know any of this. They knew only that the ferryman was dead, and that a young widow now stood where he had stood, and they made their estimate accordingly. The leader among them, in the loose way that frontier settlements have leaders, was a man named Royce Tate. He owned the freight road that ran down to the crossing, owned the store at 3 Pines and the warehouse beside it, and he held the paper on more of the valley than any one man ought. He was not a loud man. He wore a clean coat in a country of dust, and he spoke in the even, reasonable tone of someone who has never once been told no. He came to the bank that spring morning not to cross, but to make Cora an offer. The offer was this. The ferry was failing. Anyone could see it. The deck half rotten and the cable frayed, and the approaches washed out by the high water. Tate would buy it from her, ferry and landing rights and the 4 acres of bank that came with them for $200. It was not nothing. It was, he said, more than the wreck was worth, and he said it kindly, the way a man is kind to a child who does not understand the size of the world. He spread his gloved hands as he said it, as though he were laying the whole reasonable shape of the thing out on a table for her to see. A widow could not run a ferry, he said. Not really. Not through a June rise and a freight season both. The crossing was a public necessity. It could not be left to fail and drown some family in the doing. Behind him the others nodded, 6 or 7 men from 3 Pines, their thumbs hooked in their belts, watching her the way men watch a horse they have already decided to buy cheap. He was offering her a way out, Tate said, before the river took the decision from them both. Cora heard him out. She had learned from her father that a man who talks long enough will tell you what he wants without meaning to, and she listened less to the words than to the shape underneath them. The words were all about her failing. The shape underneath was a man in a hurry. Tate wanted the crossing badly, and a man does not pay $200 cash in a country short of cash for a thing he believes is worthless, and he does not bring 6 witnesses to watch him be generous unless the generosity is the part he wants remembered. She told him she would think on it. She watched him fold his gloved hands and smile and say that thinking was fine, but that the river would not wait on thought. And then she watched him ride back up the freight road with his men strung out behind him, and she stood a long while on the listing deck and felt, under the soft and treacherous planks, something that didn't match her sense of the boat. It was a hardness where there should have been give. Near the center of the deck, where the rot was worst and the planks bowed under a boot, there was a place that did not bow. She knelt and pressed her palm flat against the wet fur and felt beneath it the unmistakable resistance of a thing that had been built to bear weight and was bearing it still. Her husband had built this deck in the 2nd year of their marriage. She remembered the lumber coming, remembered him working late by lantern, remembered that he had sent her to her sister's in Boise for a fortnight that summer and told her the work went faster alone. She had thought nothing of it then. She thought of it now. What she did not yet know was that Amos Bly had built 2 decks where one would do, and that the space between them was not empty. She could not investigate it that day. The light was going and the river was rising, and a widow alone on a sinking ferry has chores that do not wait. But the question had lodged in her like a splinter under the nail, and over the days that followed it worked deeper. She went about the small, endless labor of keeping the crossing alive. She spliced the worst of the cable with wire she unwound from an old drift fence above the landing, working the strands together with a marlin spike until the splice would run smooth through the windlass sheave and not catch and fray the rest. She bailed the barge each morning and each evening, a wooden scoop and a bucket and her back bent to it, the river seeping in through the bad seams faster than seemed possible for so few gaps. She came to wonder at that, in fact, how a deck with 11 soft planks could take on water the way this one did, as though the leaking were a thing the boat did on purpose, and she filed the wondering away with the rest. She turned the old horse at the windlass. a sway-backed gray named Patch who had hauled the cable so many years. He leaned into the traces at the first touch of her hand on his neck. She hauled the occasional traveler across, a peddler with his tin and his needles, a family bound for the Kama Prairie with a milk cow swimming behind on a lead, a circuit preacher who paid in blessing because he had no coin and meant the blessing honestly. She mended the approach where the high water had cut it, hauling stone in a barrow and tamping it with a maul until a wagon could come down to the barge without bogging. The work was never finished. The work of a ferry is the work of holding a thing against a river, and the river does not rest, and so neither could she. And all the while she felt the hard place at the center of the deck under her feet, patient as a held breath, waiting on her the way the river waited on everyone. The settlement watched and made its jokes. At the store in Three Pines, the men allowed that the widow Bly was stubborn, which in their mouths was not a compliment. They allowed that she would last till the June rise, when the snowmelt came down hard out of the sawtooths, and the river would take the rotten barge to pieces, and the question would answer itself. Royce Tate said little. He renewed his offer once by letter in a careful clerk's hand, and the sum had not changed, and neither had the kindness in it. Cora wrote back 3 words, not yet decided. She did not tell him about the hard place in the deck. She did not tell anyone. There was one person at Three Pines who did not laugh. Her name was Matilda Ott, a widow herself, near 70, who kept a few goats on a steep parcel above the crossing, and who had buried 2 husbands and outlived most of the men now mocking Cora. Matilda had been in the country since before the territory had a name a man could spell, and she remembered things the settlement had agreed to forget. She came down to the bank one evening with a crock of goat cheese, and a question that was not a question. "You feel something under that deck?" she said. It was not framed as a guess. Cora looked at her a long moment and said that she did. Matilde nodded as though a thing long suspected had finally been confirmed, and she sat down on an overturned bucket and told Cora what she knew. She knew that 14 years earlier, in the autumn of 1859, a party of placer miners had come down out of the Boise Basin with the season's gold, bound for the assay office and the bank at Boise City, and that they had meant to cross at this very ferry, which in those years had been run by a man named Joseph Hale. She had seen them herself, Matilda said, from the goat parcel above the bend, 8 men and a string of mules coming down the freight road in the last good light of an October evening, dust-colored and laughing, the way men laugh when a hard season is behind them and the money is in the bags. She knew that the miners had reached the crossing, and she knew that they had never reached Boise City. The story the settlement told was that they had drowned at a freak rise, swept off the barge with their dust and their mules, the river keeping all of it as the river will. There had been a search, 3 days of men walking the banks downstream, and there had been grief, and there had been, in time, the slow forgetting that the frontier practices on its dead. But Matilda had never believed the river took them. October was low water, she said, the lowest of the year, the snowmelt long spent and the rains not yet come, and no river on its lowest legs sweeps 8 grown men and a mule string off a barge that had crossed at the spring flood without losing a soul. She had said as much at the time, to anyone who would hear, and no one had wanted to hear it, because the men who might have asked the hard questions were the men who had the most to lose by the answers. She had known Joseph Hale, a close-mouthed man who came into sudden small comforts that winter, and then, within the year, lost the ferry to a foreclosure that nobody could quite explain, since the crossing had always paid, and she had known the man who held the paper on Hale's ferry then, who took it back and sold it cheap to a newcomer named Amos Bly. And that man, she said, watching Cora's face, was the father of Royce Tate. Cora sat with this in the dark. The pieces did not yet make a picture, but she could feel their edges. A lost party of miners with a season's gold. A ferry that changed hands within a year of the loss. A second deck her husband had built in secret, over the very planks where Joseph Hale had once stood. And a man who would pay $200 in a hurry for a wreck he called worthless. What she did not yet know was that her husband had not built the false deck to hide a thing. He had built it to keep a thing safe until it could be brought out honestly. And he had died before the day he was waiting for ever came. She resolved to open the deck. It was the only way to answer the splinter under the nail. And she was her father's daughter. And her father had taught her that a question you can settle with your hands is no longer a question. It is only work you have not yet done. But she could not do it at the mooring in plain sight of the freight road, where any rider coming down to the crossing would see a widow tearing up her own ferry and carry the tale to Tate's store before noon. So she waited for the dark of the moon, and she enlisted Matilda, who for all her years could still hold a lantern steady and keep her counsel. And on a moonless night in the last week of May, they set to work. The labor was harder than Cora had reckoned. Amos had built well with the patient overbuilding of a man hiding the true purpose of his work behind the appearance of simple repair. The upper deck was pinned to the frame with iron spikes driven deep and clinched over, and the fur had swollen with the river until the planks gripped the spikes like a closed fist. Cora worked with a wrecking bar and a wooden maul, prying each plank a finger's width at a time, soaking the seams with hot water from a kettle. Matilda kept on a driftwood fire to swell the wood loose, then driving thin oak wedges to hold each gain. Her father's voice was with her the whole night. Work with the grain, he had said, never against it, for the wood remembers how it grew and will yield along the line of its growing if you have the patience to find it. She found it. Plank by plank through the cold hours, the false deck came up. It took 3 nights. On the first night, they lifted 4 planks and found beneath them a void, a hand's depth, dry as a bone, the air in it stale and cold and smelling of pitch and old wood, the air of a place sealed against the river for more than a decade. Cora knelt and breathed it and knew it for what it was, the held breath of a thing made to keep the wet out. And she understood in that first breath that her husband had been a better builder than the settlement had ever credited, because no careless man makes a void stay dry under a working ferry through 14 springs of flood. On the second night, the work turned cruel. The central planks were the ones Amos had pinned hardest, and the fur had swollen tight as a drumhead. And Cora poured kettle after kettle of scalding water along the seams and waited in the cold for the wood to give, and pried and waited again. She lifted 6 planks that night, and her hands cracked and bled at the knuckles where the bar bit, and she wrapped them in strips of flour sacking and kept on. And Matilda fed the driftwood fire and held the lantern and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that the work was not already saying. Twice the bar slipped, and Cora went down hard on the torn deck and lay a moment with the river loud beside her, and twice she got up. Her father's voice was with her the whole night. Work with the grain, he had said, never against it, for the wood remembers how it grew and will yield along the line of its growing if you have the patience to find it. She found it, seam by seam, in the dark, by feel as much as by sight. On the third night, with the eastern sky beginning to gray, and the last of the central planks finally yielding, the lantern light fell at last into the space her husband had made, and Cora saw what the deck had been built to hold. There were saddlebags, 8 of them, oiled leather gone stiff and dark with the years, laid in 2 neat rows on a bed of dry river sand that Amos had carried down plank by plank to make a cradle for them, so the leather would not rot against the wet fur. There was a tin strongbox, the kind a freight company issues for the long hauls, its lock long since rusted to a single orange mass, and there was a flat packet of oilcloth, tied with waxed cord, that Cora lifted out first, before the gold, before any of it, because it was nearest her hand, and because some instinct older than reason told her the paper would matter more than the metal, that the metal could be weighed by anyone, but the paper could only be read by the one who came looking. The lantern threw her shadow huge across the torn deck. The river ran black beside her. For a moment she did not move at all, kneeling over the open void with the cold, sealed air rising around her, and the years between Joseph Hale's last night and her own first morning closed up into a single held instant. Then she untied the cord. Inside the oilcloth was a ledger, and folded into the ledger were letters, and the ledger was in two hands. The first hand was a stranger's, cramped and hurried, and it was the tally of the miners of 1859, the careful record men keep of dust weighed and shares owed, 8 names and the weight of gold against each one. The last entry was dated the 9th of June, 1859, at the Snake River crossing. The second hand was her husband's. Amos had written in his slow square letters the account of what he had found and what he meant to do, and Cora read it kneeling on the torn deck with the river running black beside her and the old woman holding the light. He had bought the Ferry cheap, he wrote, from old Tate, not knowing the price it carried. In the 3rd year he had been replacing the deck, the original planks gone soft, and beneath them, bedded in the frame where no man would look, he had found the bodies and the gold both, where Joseph Hale had hidden them, and he had understood at once what he was looking at. The miners had not drowned. They had been killed at the crossing for their dust, struck down most likely as they waited on the barge with the mules, and Joseph Hale had hidden the evidence under his own deck, perhaps meaning to recover the gold when the search died down and the country forgot. But Hale himself had died within the year, and the foreclosure told its own tale. A man who had a fortune under his feet and lost his ferry for want of a few dollars, which meant he had never dared touch a grain of it, or never had the chance. Amos had not known whom to trust. The elder Tate had owned the paper then, and the younger Tate owned the valley now, and a man who carries an accusation against the most powerful family in 100 miles, with no proof but old bones in a stranger's ledger, is a man who soon meets an accident of his own on a dark stretch of road. So Amos had done the only thing his conscience and his caution would both permit. He had reburied the dead with what dignity he could, by lantern over 3 nights as she had labored over 3 nights, on the high bank above the flood line where the spring water would never reach them, and he had marked the place in his own memory and in the ledger. Then he had built a second deck over the gold and the record, sound enough to keep the wet out and rough enough to look like the work of a careless hand, and he had resolved to wait. He would wait, he wrote, until the law came closer than 14 miles, until there was a court and a marshal at Boise City who did not hold their office at the pleasure of the Tates, and then he would bring it all into the light at once, the gold and the bones and the names, and let the truth stand on its own legs where no one man could knock it down. He had been waiting still when the fever took him in 9 days that winter, and he had never told her. She understood now, not because he did not trust her, but because the knowing was a danger, and he had meant to carry the danger alone until the day it could be set down safely. He had run out of days. Cora understood now why the ferry leaked. Amos had let the upper deck go soft on purpose, had never caulked it properly because a sound deck invites repair, and repair invites discovery, and a failing deck is a thing men leave alone. He had hidden his secret behind rot, the way another man hides a thing behind a locked door. The settlement had mocked a ferryman for poor upkeep, and the poor upkeep had been the most careful work he ever did. She did not weep, though Matilda, watching her face in the lantern light, saw what the reading cost her. Cora folded the letters back into the ledger, and the ledger back into the oilcloth, and she sat a moment with her bleeding hands flat on the cold sand of the cradle. And then she set herself to the question of what to do. Which was the only question her father had ever taught her was worth a person's whole attention. The gold was not hers. The dead were not hers. But the truth was in her hands now, and the bringing of it into the light had become, by inheritance, her work. There were 8 names in the ledger. Cora wrote them out by lamplight in her own hand, and against each she meant to find, if she could, a living person to whom the name belonged. This was not the swift justice of stories. It was the slow arithmetic of restitution, debts settled one at a time, and it took her the better part of that summer and into the fall. She began with the names themselves. Matilde remembered 2 of the men, their faces and the towns they had spoken of on the freight road that October evening, and an old freighter at the Kama Prairie remembered a third by a scar and a way of talking, and from the third came word of a sister in Silver City, and from the sister came 2 more names traced through letters that took weeks to go and weeks to answer, and the long, patient memory of grief, which forgets nothing it was not allowed to bury properly. Cora wrote her letters at the ferry house table by lamplight after the day's crossings were done, in her father's square hand, and she rode where she had to ride, and she waited where she had to wait, and slowly the 8 names stopped being marks in a stranger's ledger and became men who had brothers and sisters and debts and plans. By the river's low water in August, she had accounted for 6 of the 8. 2 of those 6 had families that could be found and reached. The dust belonging to those 2 she meant to return in full, weighed out honestly on her father's own balance, the brass-armed scale he had carried west in her marriage chest, and that she had never once thought she would need for anything heavier than a letter. The hardest of the names was the last one in the ledger, a young man called Eli Mercer, 20 years old in 1859, whose share had been the smallest because he was the newest to the claim. Mercer had a daughter born after he went west who had never seen her father's face. Her name was Sarah, and she lived now at Mountain Home, a girl of 14, raised by an aunt who had told her only that her father had drowned in the Snake and had left it there, because what more was there to tell a child about a river? Cora rode the 2 days to Mountain Home with a portion of the gold in a canvas sack and the page of the ledger that bore Eli Mercer's name folded in her coat against her heart. She found the place at the end of a dry lane, a low house with a kitchen garden going to seed in the late summer heat, and she sat at the aunt's scrubbed pine table with a cup of chicory between her hands and the girl across from her, and she told Sarah Mercer the truth her father had carried under his deck. She told it plainly, without ornament, the way the worst and best news both ought to be told, because ornament is a thing people put on the truth to protect themselves. And Cora had not come to protect herself. Your father did not drown, she said. He was robbed and killed for his honest labor, the season's work he meant to bring home to you. And the man who did it is dead. And here is what was owed him, weighed out true. And here is the proof of who he was, and that he was on his way home when it happened. The girl did not cry at first. She held the page a long time, turning it to the window light, looking at the column of her father's name and the figure of his share in a stranger's cramped hand, 14 years old, and the writing of a man she had been told to grieve as an accident. It was the first thing she had ever held that her father's world had touched. Then she asked the only question that mattered to her, which was whether he had been coming back, and Cora told her that the ledger said so. that the last entry was the tally of men headed down to the bank with the season behind them, and that a man does not weigh out his honest share and start for the assay office unless he means to come home and spend it on the ones he left. The girl set the page down flat on the table and smoothed it with her palm, and then she cried, quietly, and her aunt came and stood behind her chair with both hands on her shoulders, and Cora sat with them and did not hurry the grief, because grief that has waited 14 years for its true name is owed a little time. Word of what Cora was doing could not be kept forever from Three Pines, and it reached Royce Tate near the end of August. He came down to the crossing a second time, and this time there was no clean coat and no even voice. He had heard, he said, that the widow Bly had been spreading a slander about his family, an old and ugly lie about the loss of 59, and he had come to put a stop to it before it cost her more than she could pay. He did not raise his hand. Men like Tate seldom do. He spoke of the cost of a reputation and the loneliness of a woman with no one to stand for her, and the ease with which a failing ferry might at last fail entirely some dark night with its keeper aboard. It was the nearest he came to the thing his father had done, and Cora heard the echo in it. She did not answer him with the gold or the bones. She answered him with the ledger. She told him, level and quiet, that the record of 1859 existed, in a stranger's hand, and her husband's both, that it named what was done and where the dead lay buried above the floodline, and that copies of the relevant pages were no longer at the crossing, but in the hands of people he could not reach, at Boise City and Silver City and Mountain Home. She told him that she had not accused his father of anything. The ledger did that. She'd only done the work of carrying it where it needed to go, and then she told him the thing that undid him, which was that the territory had changed in 14 years, that there was a district court at Boise City now, and a federal marshal who owed the Tates nothing, and that the matter was already past the point where any offer of his could call it back. Tate stood on the bank a long moment. He was a man who had built his whole life on the certainty that the past stays buried if you own enough of the ground above it, and he understood, watching this woman he had taken for a fool, that the ground had been bought out from under him by a dead ferryman with a wrecking bar and a conscience. He did not threaten her again. He turned his horse and rode up the freight road, and within the month he had sold the store and the warehouse and the freight road itself and left the valley, and the settlement never saw him after. He was not arrested. The elder Tate was beyond any court, and the proof against the family was a matter of inheritance and inference rather than the kind a jury hangs a living man on. But the foundation he stood on had been the good opinion of the valley, and that was gone. And a man like Tate cannot live where the ground no longer holds him up. He dissolved out of the country the way a thing built on falsehood dissolves when the truth comes up underneath it. The dead of 1859 were brought down at last from the high bank where Amos had laid them, and they were buried properly in the little ground at Three Pines, 8 graves with 8 names, and the circuit preacher who had once paid Cora in blessing came and read over them, and most of the settlement came too. The men who had laughed at the widow stood at the graves with their hats in their hands. None of them said much to her. There was not much that could be said, for there is no apology shaped to fit a thing that large, and the wiser among them seemed to know it and offered her silence instead, which was the more honest gift. 1 or 2 of the younger ones, the ones who had laughed loudest because they were least sure of themselves, came down to the crossing in the weeks after and offered to help with the ferry, awkward and red about the ears, and she let them because the work was real, and her hands were only 2, and because she had learned from her father that a person who is sorry is best given a thing to do with the sorrow, a plank to carry, or a stone to set. so the sorrow turns into something a body can stand to live beside. Cora did not keep the gold. The dust belonging to the men with families went to those families, weighed out honest on her father's balance. The shares of the men with no living kin she gave over to the new court at Boise City, to be held against any claim. And what could not be claimed, she asked to be spent on a proper road down to the crossing, so that no family bound for the Camas Prairie would ever again risk the high water on a barge that a careful man had let go soft. She kept the ferry. She rebuilt the deck that autumn with seasoned fir hauled down from the sawtooth slopes, and she caulked every seam with oakum and pine pitch the way her father had taught her, until it would turn water for a decade, and she drove each spike at the angle that would not split the plank. She built it sound. There was no longer any reason to hide. The new deck did not bow under a boot. It bore the weight of wagon and team, and the long freight that came once the road was cut, and the crossing at the bend below Ferry Butte became, in the years that followed, the surest on that stretch of the Snake. Cora Bly ran it for 31 years. She married no one. She took Sarah Mercer in when the girl's aunt died, and taught her the windlass and the cable and the reading of Green Oak, the way her own father had taught her, so that the knowing would not die when the knower did. And in the long evenings, she sometimes told the story to a traveler waiting on the bank for the morning crossing, though she told it plainly and without heat. And she never once said that she had told the men of Three Pines so. If you have ever been counted out by people who never troubled to learn what your hands could do, you may know something of what that woman felt, standing on her sound new deck above the place where the truth had lain. She did not gloat. The work had said it all for her, and the work went on saying it every time a wagon crossed dry. Matilda Ott lived to see the road cut, and died the winter after, and Cora buried her in the little ground at Three Pines not far from the 8, and kept her goats, the old balance her father had carried west, the one she had weighed the gold on. She hung on the wall of the ferry house where she could see it from the windlass, and it stayed there all her years, a little tarnished, perfectly true. Long after, when Sarah was grown and running the crossing in her turn, a young engineer came through surveying for a bridge that would one day make the ferry unnecessary, and he asked the old woman at the windlass why the deck of so plain a ferry had been built so uncommonly well, with every spike clinched and every seam still tight after all the years. Cora was past 80 then, her hands knotted but steady on the cable. She looked down at the planks a moment before she answered. "A man I loved built the first deck to hide the truth," she said, "and I built this one because there was no more truth that needed hiding." Then she turned the windlass, and the old horse leaned into its work, and the barge went out across the brown water as it had 10,000 times before, sound under her feet, carrying its honest load to the far bank.